I'm the Director of Ed-Neuro Neuroscience, and I'd just like to wish you a very warm, both metaphorically and actually physically warm, welcome to this year's Ed-Neuro Neuroscience Christmas Lecture. It's really, really amazing that you've all turned out on an extremely cold and snowy night, and thank you for coming and for expressing your interest. And we've got a really wonderful pair of speakers who are going to talk about this very interesting area of what we can learn about intelligence, how the brain works, partly by watching and learning from other organisms, very simple insect organisms, which nonetheless have simple nervous systems that enable them to do extraordinarily complicated things. And then also kind of reverse engineering. How can we model these things, and how can we apply artificial intelligence so that we can build machines that can at least match the intelligence of insects and go beyond that. And so we've got Barbara Webb and Sethu Vijaya-Kumar, both professors at the university, with different but overlapping interests. And so it's a real pleasure to introduce them. I'm very grateful to them. Sethu particularly because he's flying off to Japan tomorrow, and we hope he makes it in one piece. But to both of them, because they work together to put together a sort of double act. So what we'll do is we'll have Barbara speaking first, and then Sethu. But I have some very important announcements, which I'm particularly keen everybody pays close attention to, because there's going to be a party afterwards to which you're invited. It's free, and what we're going to do is, at the end of the two lectures, you'll see a Google map with a Google Street View of where you're going, which is basically across the informatics building, where you will be greeted on the ground floor by warmth, wine, canapes, and an exhibition. So that'll be immediately afterwards. You're all most welcome, and as I say, we'll repeat the directions as to how to get there slightly more explicitly at the end of the lecture. So you've heard enough from me, and I'll hand over to Barbara, who's our first, for the first part of the game of two halves.
Thank you. And thanks very much for inviting me to give this lecture, and I hope I'll keep it short and to the point. So the title we managed to settle on when we were invited to do this was a little hard for us both to come together and come up with a title, but we decided insects and robots covered pretty much what both of us do. And at least a number of you are probably familiar with the human brain, and it's pretty complicated, some 100 billion neurons. I've kind of represented the insect brain here, although really that's probably a bit bigger than it should be by proportion. It has less than 1 million neurons, so bees, for example, have around 1 million neurons. Other insects, more like 100,000. You can fit the brain of an insect onto the head of a pin to give you an idea of the size. So, from my point of view, this is appealing because it's 1 million times less complicated, and so therefore should be easier to understand. Okay, so it should be possible, really, with today's technology, for us to understand and to simulate what insect brains can do. And you might say, okay, well that's all very well, but why should we bother? Because insects don't do anything interesting compared to a human brain. So we might find out about insects, but what will that tell us? So what I'm hoping to cover in this little half lecture is to give you some incentive of why insect brains in fact are quite interesting. Some of you, particularly those with an AI background, might be familiar with Simon's ant. So this was an idea proposed by Herbert Simon some time ago, in 1969 book actually. He said, when we watch this ant crawling along the beach, you might see this trajectory that looks very complicated. But in fact, maybe there's nothing very complicated going on, and in fact it's just the fact that the beach has different contours and obstacles and objects, And the ant is just reacting to those, and therefore it takes a complicated path, but all the complexity is actually in the beach, and none of it is in the ant. Okay, so he said, an ant viewed as a behaving system is quite simple. The apparent complexity of its behavior over time is largely a reflection of the complexity of the environment in which it finds itself. Interestingly, he then went on to say, I should like to explore this hypothesis, but with human being substituted for ant. So the point he was actually trying to make is that maybe a lot of our behavior, similarly, is actually shaped by our environment rather than in our head. So I think he was right in the sense that we shouldn't assume that all intelligence is just in the head, okay, or in the brain. Most of our competence is actually due to how we interact with the world, and it's a common property to us and ants and other animals. And I'm sure you've all experienced this in the last week, that where you have been walking has been largely shaped by the environment and the obstacles and the different paths that are clear or not clear and so on. However, it's also the case that Simon was wrong about the ant. So the ant's path, the paths that ants actually take, is not just a reflection of some very simple internal program that's just bumping off the contours of the beach. So this is work that's been done by a PhD student of mine, Michael Mangan. He's been looking at what the real ant does, okay? And this is an ant that lives in a quite desert environment, but in fact it has a lot of little bushes. So this is kind of a top view where each of the green patches is a little bush, and then the ground is sand. And this is roots taken by one particular ant that's going from its home down here up to its nest up here, and then it's going back again. In fact, I think this is just its outward roots. So every time it goes out from its nest, it takes this route up to the feeder and collects some food, and then it might come back by another route. And the main point is that this blue patch actually represents about 20 paths by this ant, and every single time it goes the same way. Okay, it follows this same route. And the information it has to follow that route looks something like this. So these are omnidirectional pictures taken along the route. So you can see it sees lots of grass, and then it sees more clumps of grass and more clumps of grass. So it seems pretty difficult to imagine that it actually knows where it is at any point in time. But in fact, it does know where it is. And you can test that by what are called displacement experiments. So for example, you take this particular ant from the nest and put it at the feeder. So it hasn't gone out there, it hasn't found its way out there, and then should know which direction to come back, but it knows it's at the feeder and it follows its normal route back. So here, the blue parts are previous routes that this ant has taken, and the black line is the actual route it took on this occasion when you moved it. You can also take, this is another ant, so this is ant A, this is ant B, who has a different route home from the feeder. So you can see it takes a different route around these different obstacles. And it consistently takes that route, and if, for example, you take it from the feeder and put it halfway along, it recognizes where it is and goes home along the same route. And similarly, if you take that ant from the nest and put it halfway along, it goes along the route. So it actually knows where it is. It can recognize from this really quite poor information where it is. Okay, so how do ants do this? Well, there's probably several mechanisms involved, but one of the important ones is something called visual homing. So ants basically can use the surrounding landmarks, i.e. these clumps of grass, to indicate which direction they should move at any point in time to reach a location which they remember the relative landmarks there. So this is probably easiest to explain by an example that you might be familiar with. If you were trying to find your way to George Square and you started out over here, well, you probably know that George Square actually lies somewhere between the castle and the crags. Okay, so if those were the only two things you could see, you could pretty well orient yourself and head off, at least start in the right direction. And as you get closer, there might be other landmarks you can use. So it's not that you can't see George Square at all from where you are, but you can see the things around it, and you know, if I was in George Square, the castle would be on this side and the crags on that side. Therefore, this is the way I should go. So ants seem to be able to do this behavior. And in fact, lots of other animals can do this behavior as well, other insects. So in this example, actually let me start it running, and then, because it takes a little while, and then I'll explain. So this is an experiment done on a cricket, and it's based on the Morris water maze, and I think Richard Morris is actually in the audience. So some of you will be familiar, the Morris rat water maze is you take a big pool of water that's kind of coloured so the rat can't see under the water, and there's a small platform at one location. You throw the rat in, it swims around frantically, it finds the platform and pulls itself out, and then it's happy. And then you take it out and you throw it in again, and the next time it's more likely to go directly to this platform, okay? In this case, for the cricket, we have a heated floor, and there's just one cool spot, and the cricket can only see that. The only perceptual cue is that I've run across it and it's cool. So you can see the cricket's not very happy. It's running around the arena trying to find its way out in the same way that rats do. So this is the first trial. And what's significant is that it uses these cues, none of which are actually at the location of the cool spot, but it's the relative position of these cues that help it find what it wants to find. So it's going to keep running around for a little while, I think. And I believe rats do this too. The first time you put them in, they start by going around the edges, but then they start to explore to see if there's anywhere else that's a better place to be in this area. And with a bit of luck, they'll actually find the safe place. Okay, so this is now trial 3, and you can see the cricket is behaving quite differently. It's no longer following the walls, but seems to be trying to get around and find the place that it's found before. And in a moment it's going to find it, and there it is. Okay, so it stops as soon as it's on the cool spot and it doesn't move again. It's really quite happy to be there. And now if we go a couple more trials, it's behaving quite differently again, and it looks as though the cricket is looking around, checking out where things are, and then it goes pretty much directly to the cool spot and stops. Okay? So this is an arbitrary task. It's not a task that crickets were evolved to do, but they seem to be able to learn to do it. And I should stress this is work that was done with Michael Maven and also with Jan Besnitz, a postdoc of mine. So this is just showing you the time it takes for the cricket to get to the cool spot as you increase the number of trials. And what you can see is that this time decreases quite a lot. One interesting thing we found is that it actually decreases faster if you actually give the cricket a natural scene. Instead of these big black and white environment, you give it natural scene around it, then it actually does it quite well and finds the cool spot in 10 or 20 seconds. And the way to test that it's actually using the visual surroundings to do this is to rotate the visual surroundings. So you rotate these cues, and you look to see, does the cricket go back just to the same spot, you know, in absolute space? Maybe it has some other cue that it was using. Or does it go to the cue to the spot that corresponds to the rotation? So this is a fictive cool spot. Or does it just go to some random spot in between? And what we find is it very clearly goes to this fictive cool spot, i.e. the spot that corresponds to the rotation of the visual world. Okay. So this is nice and interesting. This type of place learning ability has been shown now in several different insects. So it was originally shown in cockroaches. We copied that to show it in crickets. And very recently, people have shown that fruit flies can actually learn this as well. When this is done in rats, the behavior is very closely associated to mechanisms of spatial memory in the hippocampus. And this is not a rat brain, this is a human brain again. The hippocampus is a little area quite deep in the middle of the brain that seems to be involved certainly in memory for humans and probably in spatial memory for humans as well. However, insects don't have a hippocampus. Okay, so how are they solving this task? Well, we have a few ideas. If they can actually, when they are in a safe place, if they could store that picture, a picture of what they see in that position, then there's actually some very simple solutions that will get them there. And we can actually test these solutions to see if they behave like the cricket using robots. So this is just one example of a robot that we've used in some of these experiments. So it has a camera that's looking up at a little ball bearing here so that it gets a 360-degree view of the world. I'm actually going to show you a different robot that was built by Ralph Möller and works in a sort of similar way. So what it does is that in this location, it basically looks for the edges, and all it remembers is what was the average direction of edges in the world. And then when it gets to a new location, it works out what's the new average direction of those edges, takes the difference of those two averages, those two vectors, and it goes back to its home. So let me just, run that for you. And this robot actually is built entirely of analog electronics, so it doesn't even have a program in it. It's just straightforward. So it just stores the home vector, and then it can find its way back from anywhere in this arena. As long as it can see the same shapes, it can find its way back. And in fact, you can kind of show that it's doing this by, for example, moving one of the shapes, and then it tries to find what's the best match. So what's my best visual match with where the shape is, okay? So you can confuse it, and then it will find its way back if the shapes are in the same position. Okay. So that's one solution to this problem. We've actually been looking a little bit more at a slightly different solution, also a very simple solution. So what this algorithm does is to just compute the difference of the current view and the previous view. So the basic idea is if I see the world from here and I move a little bit, then the world will have changed, but only a bit. And if I just do a simple pixel by pixel image match, it'll be fairly similar. If I move a bit further, the world will have changed more, and as I move, it will increase the difference. Okay, so here what's shown, this is the position in the world on these two axes. If you're at the home position, then the world looks exactly like it did when you were there before. As you move away from that home position, the world looks more and more different. And in fact, for natural scenes, this turns out to be quite a smooth gradient. And all you need to do to get home is to just keep going in a direction that things look more similar. If you move and things look less similar, then you should turn around and go the other way. And as long as things keep looking more and more similar, then that's the way you should go. And this actually works quite well. And we use it to kind of imitate what happens with the cricket and the robot. And in particular, to show that if you have these very distinct black landmarks, the cricket can't do those quite as well as when there's this natural scene. And that's also true for this algorithm, that it's much better for a natural scene than for the distinct landmarks. And just as a control, this is in the dark, basically. And in the dark, obviously, you can't use visual surroundings, and the cricket can't use behavior in the dark. Okay, so that's fine. If they could store this visual memory, then they could solve the task. But how and where do they store this visual memory? That's the really interesting question, and one that we don't yet know the answer to, unfortunately. But we do know, at least in terms of insects, that one part of the brain for the insects that is involved in learning, possibly in visual learning, it's better demonstrated for olfactory learning, learning about smells, is a bit called the mushroom body. So this is a beautiful picture from Heisenberg of the brain of a fly kind of coloured in to show different parts of the brain. So these are the fly's eyes. It has these huge compound eyes. And all this green part is actually visual processing areas for the fly. But the bit that we're interested in is this bit here. It doesn't look very much like a mushroom, but it looks a little bit like a mushroom, perhaps. And so this pair of them, there's a paired set of neuropils that are called the mushroom bodies. And these seem to be quite critical for learning. So if you do genetic manipulations that knock out certain parts of these mushroom bodies, you have different effects on the learning of behavior of the fly. And there are some quite significant similarities, but probably also some significant differences in learning mechanisms that we know about in human brains. For example, there's a very important role for dopamine signaling. So dopamine is known in humans to be involved in reward, that you can actually substitute release of this neurotransmitter dopamine into the brain for a reward, and rats, for example, will learn to respond to something that gives them dopamine. And it's definitely quite important. It's also important for flies, so it seems to be one of the major signals for them, not so much for positive rewards, but actually for punishments, seem to be signaled by this. Okay. So I'm actually coming towards my final slide because I thought I'd keep this to the point. So really what we're trying to work towards in the research that we're doing is an insect brain architecture for a robot. So this is a kind of sketch of what we think are the critical parts, and of course it's still, the real brain is more complicated than this. But just to give you some sort of feeling for what we're interested in, what we're trying to do. So there's, for example, visual, auditory, chemical, different kinds of sensors. There's also what's called proprioceptors, which are sensors for your own movement, and all animals, including insects, have lots of sensors just to know their own movements. And it seems in the insect control, it has a lot of very direct reflexes. So it has direct visual reflexes. For example, if the world rotates around the insect, it knows that it's actually slipping, and so it will start to rotate. It has very direct auditory reflexes. It has very direct reflexes to odors and to other kinds of inputs. So those are kind of indicated by these pathways here, these very direct pathways that go down to the ganglia, which are almost like the spinal cord of the insect. So it has a brain, and then it has little bunches of neurons down its body, which are called ganglia. And these control, for example, the legs, the wings, all the other organs. There's a couple of quite interesting structures along the way that seem to be involved in actually trying to coordinate the behaviors. So if you're reacting to vision and you're reacting to sound, maybe those two things are in conflict and you have to find some way to coordinate them. And there's an area called the central complex that looks very interesting and may be involved in that. But here are the mushroom bodies, and the important point really to take away about them here is that they actually are this little sideline. So there's always these direct routes, but at the same time, the signals are being shunted sideways into this little mushroom body area, and it comes back in and then modulates the reflex behaviors that the animal is doing according to rewards it might be getting. So this is what we're labelling value here. And then just one other pathway that we're quite interested in, but I won't say too much more about, but I think Setu is maybe going to talk about. We also think that when the cricket or the insect, the fly, the ant, does its behavior, it doesn't just do the behavior and then find out what happens as a response, but it has what's called efference copy. So what it does is actually it has some expectation of what's going to happen to it as it moves in the world. So for example, if it is turning towards the sound, then it expects that the world is going to slip sideways, and so it doesn't have its normal visual reaction to this sideways slip. And so this is also a very interesting part of the brain. People are very interested in this in human brains, in animal brains, and so on. Okay, so I think I'm ready to pass on.
Just before we do that, Barbara,
Yes.
it would be quite good to have while Seth is getting himself set up. Just if anybody has any questions specifically to Barbara, there'll be time for more questions at the end. But if anybody wanted to ask Barbara a question, just put your hand up and shout. We don't have any roving mics, I'm afraid.
Going back to the ant part at the very beginning,
Yes.
how do you know that the ant was using visual signals to find its way as opposed to following a scent trails?
Okay, we know that these ants don't use scent trails. Basically, because they're in the desert, the scent would disappear too fast. And also that each individual ant has its own route that it follows rather than any others. There's also been lots of other experiments on these ants that actually show that if you manipulate, like with the robot, where if you move the landmarks around, then where they search is a different place if you change it.
Any other questions? Okay, Barbara, well that was fantastic. So if you just hand over the mic to Seth, we'll move on to the second half. So over to you, Seth. Thank you very much.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Kind of. Okay. So again, welcome to this neuroscience lecture, and I'm going to try and make this this brave effort of yours a bit worthwhile by trying to show you some interesting stuff that you've been doing, especially in the field of robotics and in the field of comparing human behavior, so anthropomorphic human behavior. And Barbara talked about how simple behaviors, so simple mechanisms can generate fairly complex looking behavior. So we're interested in indeed looking at how this complex behavior is achieved, not only in insects but also in humans, and maybe try and find some inspiration in this kind of computational mechanism that we do to actually build better machines, for example. So when we talk about robots, we've essentially have three aspects that we need to worry about. We need to plan a particular motion. We need to actually carry out that plan by generating a particular control command, and then you need to sense and provide appropriate feedback. And this kind of a problem is the same problem that you would tackle if I were to reach for something and lift an object up. So you would do essentially the same sort of tasks. So if you think about a high-level view of what it takes to make a move, then you can think about a schematic like this, where you have a particular plan which tells you that if I want to reach for something, then I should, follow a particular trajectory, and you have a mechanism which generates motor commands. So in humans, these are commands to your muscles. Okay? In robots, these are electrical signals to your motors. And that changes the state of your plant. It moves your body, it changes the state, the joint angles of a robot, and then you have a bunch of sensory apparatus. So we have eyes, proprioceptive skin, and we have a bunch of other sensors. The robots have a similar set of sensors, so vision, touch sensors, proximity sensors. And the idea is we should have a system which can actually work in an environment that is relatively flexible. So what do I mean by that? It's easy to create robotic systems that repeat and do things over and over again in a very controlled environment. Humans, on the other hand, are very robust. In other words, we can deal with situations. The snow came down, you guys probably managed to get here without too much trouble. Now, if I try to get a robot to do that, it would be pretty hard. So the idea is, can we build the same level of robustness in artificial robotic systems by looking at how humans do certain things, how humans adapt to novel situations. So that's why I sort of put this little picture here which says that the kind of problems that we tackle is very similar when we deal with anthropomorphic robotic systems. Okay, so again, I want to emphasize that hopefully at the end of this 30 minutes, I can convince you that learning and adaptation is actually a very key element of doing what I just wanted the robots, or even understanding how humans do it. It's because essentially all these components, so sensing, planning, moving, and representation, are inherently difficult to do. So, for example, sensing this incomplete state information, we've got the same structure can generate similar signals. Planning is, again, I'll come to that in a bit. So planning is very hard to do because I can reach for something in n number of ways. So how do I choose one optimal, correct way of doing it? In general, moving is hard because if I try to reach for something and if you have a little weight attached to my hand, or if an object is lighter or heavier, then I have to adapt to that. And representation is another area that I'm not going to talk about today, but what I hope to do is today give you some examples from each of these three different areas, so sensing, planning, and moving, and show that the actual fact that we're able to adapt as humans, it is a key capability, and it is something that is quite desirable for robotic systems that we want to build. Okay, so to start with, I want to look at how we should try and adapt to movements. So what do I mean by adapting the movements? So a traditional control system would look like this. So you want to do something like reaching for a moving target. If I ask you to follow a ball in space, then you want to do that by using a control system which provides some signals to your motors, at the same time use the sensory feedback to correct for these errors. So this is what I mean by compensating for errors. In other words, if I want to get to some place, I can ask the question, am I there yet? No, there's an error, so I basically change my motor commands to compensate for those errors. So that's one way of doing it, and the next video actually shows you what happens if you apply that sort of method. It turns out that you are always a bit behind. So you're trying to compensate and correct for errors, but you're actually always lagging behind. So the obvious next step to do is to actually try and predict the consequence of your action. This is what Barbara mentioned towards the end of her talk. So instead of waiting for the result of your motor command to show up, we can try and be smart and actually predict what would happen if I apply a particular muscle command to my hand or a particular motor command to a particular motor of the robot. And this is what we mean by learning a model of a system. Okay, so again, predicting the consequences of our action, there are many ways to do it. So I'm going to go through a couple of ways of doing it. So one way of doing it is, for something like a two-joint robot arm, you can sort of write the maths if you're in maths or in informatics. That's our favorite hobby. And then you would basically, for a 2 degree of freedom robot, you can write torques in this joint. That's the equation where you sort of variables which define the length and the angle in there. So you can actually compute it. Okay, and that's what many roboticists do. Now, if I try to scale this kind of an approach to a slightly more complicated robot, okay, if I try to do it on a 7 degree of freedom robot, so essentially what you're trying to do by predicting the consequence of your action is trying to predict, if I apply a particular force, what should happen to my state of the system, right? Now, if I try to do that for something like that, it's going to be horribly complicated and messy. And this is already a sort of ignoring so complicated real-world scenarios like friction and Coriolis forces and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so but humans are very good at doing this. So let me try and take you through an experiment, and this is what we call internal model learning. So this picture here is actually a top view of a person sitting on a table with what we call a manipulandum. It's nothing but a 2-link robot arm, okay, which can apply forces to your hand while you move. So if I ask this person to start from this position and move to this position like a straight line motion, okay, so many of you can do that blindfolded. You do that all your life, and so you can do that no sweat. So now if the robot now applies a force, it pushes you to the right, okay, so that's what's going to happen. So you apply a particular command and then you deviate it. You give yourself or this person a few more trials and you will get better at doing that. And then if I take off that force from the manipulandum, I stop perturbing you to pushing you to the right, what will happen is actually you will overcompensate in the other direction. So effectively, this is evidence to show that you do not purely react to errors. You do not purely react to, I should be here, I made an error, and let me correct a bit. You actually, in such scenarios, you internalize a systematic perturbation. You internalize this process of the fact that your arm dynamics is no longer correct. There is something pushing you to the right, so I must try and internalize this force. And effectively, this is evidence to show that humans are very good at internalizing such perturbations or changes. So if I were to actually attach a very heavy load to my arm and sort of walk around with it, then after a while I'll become very good at moving my arms around and making accurate movements with that load attached. Whereas if you take it out, then I may not perform as well. So you internalize these things. So and again, if you add a little perturbation, you see this. This is what we call leftover behavior. So humans are very good at doing it. So how can we get robots to be as adaptive? So one way of doing it is going away from these analytical dynamics and doing what a baby does when he or she is born. So you can do what's called motor babbling. In other words, you collect a lot of data, you apply certain commands to your joints, you collect a lot of data which says, your positions, velocities and accelerations of each joints and the torques that you apply, and then you apply a machine learning technique to, again, internalize this model. So I won't go into the details of how you do that, but for those of you who are interested, it's essentially approximating some nonlinear function by a bunch of local linear models and running the whole machinery of regression. Now, the smart thing here is that we can do this very naively, but the reason why we managed to do a machine learning algorithm like that has been able to deal with the complexity of a robotic system like a multi-joint, multi-degree of freedom robot like this, for example, is because we exploit some very interesting properties of our body, of physics, of the kinematics. So, for example, if you actually strap a person in and measure the joint angles of the kind of movements they make, and if you get them to do everyday tasks, this is what we did actually, and then we do dimensionality analysis of this data. It turns out that we do not actually cover the entire range of motion. Well, one obvious reason is because your fingertip, so whenever your shoulder moves, your fingertip kind of moves. So there's a correlation between your fingertip and your shoulder. So you have a sort of tree structure in your body, and there's strong correlations between individual joints. There's other things like people use very idiosyncratic movements to achieve certain tasks. And again, there's a reason to that. I'll come back to that in a bit. So it turns out that data actually lies in a low-dimensional manifold, and if you have a way of dealing with that and working and learning in those scenarios, then we will be successful. And so the reason why I want to put up this slide is this is a schematic of a machine learning algorithm that we use to do this learning that I just talked to you about. Now, if you are neuroscientists in this crowd, and if you study the cerebellum, then you might find that there is an interesting sort of match between this sort of a schematic of high-dimensional input pouring into the sort of some selective receptive fields and going out to a motor action to this slice through your cerebellum. So cerebellum in the human brain is supposed to be the seat of learning of these internal models, or where the actual adaptation actually happens in the motor system. So cerebellum has a very regular structure, and you have sort of sensory inputs coming in, impinging through the parallel fibers on Purkinje cells, with the Golgi cells modulating the actual threshold. And climbing fibers actually carry errors from your motor. So if you actually try to reach for a target and you miss, then errors are signaled in our system through the climbing fiber. And then the deep nuclei actually receives the motor commands that move our muscles. So there's an interesting sort of analogy between machine learning techniques and the way the algorithms that we actually use to get robots to move in an interesting fashion, and the actual sort of human brain. I'm not saying that the mechanism is the same, but there is an interesting analogy. And we've studied this analogy under the title of cerebellum control architecture, both in terms of what the brainstem does and what the cerebellum does for fine-tuning. So I'm not going to go to the details of this, but I want to show you a little video of the actual robot learning using this algorithm that I just mentioned. Okay, so here's the robot trying to reach for this, and now we have the algorithm switched on, which essentially records these movements, positions, velocities, and accelerations, and the torques that we're currently applying to the joints. And it's internalizing this sequence of commands. So eventually, at the end of this process, what the robot would have achieved is it would have figured out what is the appropriate joints torque that needs to be applied so that you can move your fingertip in a particular fashion. where you want it to move. So effectively, this process is doing something that a growing baby would actually do. You would make a particular movement, figure out if the correct result has been achieved. If it's not, you change, shift, and you adapt. Now on top of that, we can get the robot to balance a pole, and again, by the same process of learning, right? So it basically looks at the consequence of moving a fingertip in a particular way on this pole, and basically adapts and changes the direction it moves to achieve the result that it's asked to do, which is keep the two colored blobs, the red and the yellow blobs, straight. Okay, so that's what it's told to do. And eventually, it basically learns how to do this. So again, this is not pre-programmed behavior. It's learning this behavior from discovery. And again, you can take out the tennis ball from top of the pole and do the same thing. And what happens the first time is it will fail because the dynamics of the pole has changed, right? But it's got some initial seeding, and it online adapts and changes its behavior to account for this change in environmental conditions or the tool that you're using. So this is an interesting demonstration of the fact that learning and adaptation are quite key for humans, of course, but even for robotic systems, because things change all the time. And so there's some interesting implications for rehabilitation. So those of you who are interested in this area, there's always this debate about, say you have a stroke patient who's got impaired motor ability. Say you've got minimal or reduced motor capability on the right side of your, say for walking. Then there's two schools of thought. Whether one school says you should actually make the right side work harder to improve. On the other hand, there's this other school of thought which says you should actually make the right side be supported by a robotic system and basically help the right side and obviously reduce the level of help. And this sort of question of how does learning happen and how does adaptation happen? So this is, again, I don't want to go to the details of this, but this is a thing where you're trying to reach for something and somebody pushes you to, there's a deflection to the left. Now the question is, you can either learn by just asking them to reach straight, in which case you will be deflected off to the side and then eventually you will get better. Or you could have another sequence where you're actually asked to sort of reach to the left, and then the desired movement will be quite close to what you actually want it to happen. And maybe learning is more effective in this kind of scenario because you get data in the right part of the space. So that's food for thought. Okay, so the next two bits are, I won't go to the details of some of these things, but I just want to give you a glimpse of some other adaptation paradigms. So this was about, what I talked about was about how to realize a motor plan. In other words, if somebody told you you should move from A to B, how do you realize that motion? What are the forces that you need to apply to each of my muscles to do that? Now, where do you get this plan from? Who tells you how to move and in what direction to move? And it turns out this is a problem that's been studied in robotics, in human motor control for many, many years. So that's the plan bit that I'm talking about. And the reason why it's very interesting is because there are several levels of redundancy in your motor plan. For example, if it's a simple task of going from position A to position B, there are various choices open to you. You can take one of these paths to get there. Let's say you choose the green path. Then to achieve this green path, I have an additional level of redundancy because my joint angles can move in redundant fashion. I can keep my position, fingertip the same, and move my joint, but my fingertip is still the same. So there's a redundancy at the level of joints. Okay? Then there's also redundancy if you've got actuator systems which can achieve the same positions with different forces. Then you've got redundancy at the level of torques, and there's also redundancy at the level of stiffness. And this is what I want to focus on today, because it's a very interesting human trait that we modulate stiffness for different tasks in a very interesting fashion. Okay, let me get to that. So before I get to that, there are various ways of learning. So you don't have to plan for everything. You could actually look at somebody doing something and mimic it. Okay, that's one way of planning, and we do use that. So, for example, we could get people's motion, capture it on a trajectory, and then play it back on this robot. And I'll show you some of the system, some of the motion at the end. But the other way of doing it is optimizing. Now, this is the only equation slide. So, if you want, so I just want to sort of point out that the way you do that is by modeling the system. In other words, figuring out how the system reacts to particular forces. And this is exactly what we did in the first part of the talk. How do you react? How do you predict? Okay? Then you have to define what is good and bad. So you have to really say, I want to be accurate, or I want to be fast, or I don't want to trip over, I want to maintain stability. So there are all the different sort of goodness criterion, and the goodness criterion may be different for different people and under different circumstances. And then if you optimize these things, you get what is called an optimal control law. And this optimal control law can be used to generate motion or plan a particular movement. Okay? So again, I won't go to the details of this, but when you have a learning system, what you can do is, in the planning phase, you can replace your analytical dynamics with this learned dynamics, and then when something changes, like if I have a little heavy weight on my hand, then I can adapt and change the dynamics to cope for that. So when the plan is structured into the dynamics, then you can get optimal plans, much more efficient optimal plans. So what are the implications for robotics in this? Okay, so there is some interesting. So when we do reach and plan, so when we reach for something, if you actually measure the joint angles, you will see that we do not repeat things again and again in the same way. We have an interesting variation. So in robotics, the way people traditionally planned some movement was, if you wanted to move this fingertip from this initial position to A, B, or C, what you would do is you would plan this movement and then do what is called inverse kinematics, and then define particular movements of the joint space. But humans, if you look at human movements, we do achieve good accuracy at the fingertip, but we get large variations at the joint angles. So this is what is called a minimum intervention principle. In other words, we do not necessarily need to correct for things that do not affect our task. So while I'm reaching for something, if somebody pushes me down, as long as my fingertip is not moved, I do not need to correct for that. So this is what's called a minimum intervention principle. And it turns out that humans do that very nicely, but using the optimization principle that I just talked about, we can get similar sort of planning behaviors on robotic systems. Okay, so that was what should happen in the planning stage. But as I promised you, there's one element which is quite crucial, which is in control, is what is called impedance or stiffness. So this is an example of a robot, a 1 degree of freedom, a one joint robot, which is driven by muscle-like springs. And now he's moving it without any high slip. So maybe I should just start again and sort of. Okay, so it's driven by EMG signals, and this is the situation early on is where you can actually move the robot with low stiffness. Okay, so only one of the muscles or one of the springs are actuated. And then after a while, he's going to do the same reaching movements where the EMG signals are coupled to these springs. So you will see that you get the same movement, but now with an increased stiffness or co-contraction. Now this is quite important because so you can actually reach for the same place with increased stiffness. Now, why is this important? It's because it changes the property of the system. So, for example, now, if there's an external perturbation, having higher stiffness naturally compensates for this sort of perturbation, and you're able to correct for these things naturally. Okay? So we've been working at transferring such impedance behaviors like these behaviors onto multiple different variable impedance systems. So we've been working on the hardware side of achieving similar variable impedance patterns as humans do, both for robustness and for reliable task execution. And where does this become important? It becomes important in cases where you have people interacting very closely with robotic systems. So this is an exoskeleton, and this is built by a company called Cyberdyne in Japan. And this is essentially used for two purposes. It's either used for force augmentation, or it's used for helping people with disabilities. So stiffness control in such robotic systems is extremely important, because if you have a very stiff robot and if you try to do something and the robot doesn't react in an appropriate fashion, then it can basically rip your leg off. Okay, it's not what you want. So this is a robotic system that we have at the Informatics Forum, where we have now the ability to control the stiffness. So you can have high accuracy movements with very soft and flexible variable impedance joints. And this is the sort of ultimate trade-off. So accuracy and speed with safety. And this is the kind of things that we're looking for. And essentially, this is what humans do naturally. And so when we sort of start thinking about robotic systems, then we really want to look at what the humans are able to do. So I'll talk for another sort of 2 or 3 minutes and show you some quick glimpses of why planning is important. So let me ask you a question. So when we say do a task like throwing a ball, okay? So you might think, why is learning and optimization very important? Why don't we just look at how humans do it, or how somebody else does it, and just get the robot to just repeat it? So it turns out there's some interesting patterns. So now if you use, this is a simulation of a 2-joint robot arm. It's exactly the same robot arm, it's got the same dynamics and everything, but the only thing that has changed is the actual weight of the ball. So it turns out that if the weight of the ball is below a certain threshold, then the most optimal thing to do for throwing large distances while minimizing energy is to actually throw overhead. But if the ball is slightly heavier, then the best thing to do is do that. And this comes out of optimization. So by optimizing this, we get these strategies where we say the right thing to do for when the ball is heavier is to do that. And actually, if you give a person or a robotic system more time, then it can come up with even cleverer strategies. So we gave it more time. Okay? And that's not very intuitive. And so optimization, so just mimicking human movement is good to a large extent, but you get some interesting, surprising new surprising things. Okay, so the last bit, again, I just want to go through this quickly, is that we also do learning at the level of sensing. So one area of sensing where this is sort of quite what humans do is what's called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. So this is a robot trying to stabilize its image. So the left eye is being stabilized while moving its head. So this is something we do very well. So while I move my head, I can focus on a particular object or a particular person. And this is an example of using what is called retinal slip to learn the right compensation for a particular movement. And then using it to do things like attention, so attending to natural stimuli. So this is on the sensory side of things. We can do similar things where it's not just the motor, it's the sensory adaptation, which is very important for real-time both visual attention and for things like gaze stability while walking or moving. And we do that every day without really thinking about it. But it's a pretty hard thing, and we've got very good circuitry, adaptive circuitry. So if you wear a prism lens which distorts your vision, then you're able to adapt to that in some trials and change this. So as part of the live demo, I'm actually going to show you this other system that we've been working with. So this is the EMG controlled sort of robotic manipulation, multi-joints robotic manipulation, and this is again the aim of these projects is to try and find closer human-robot interaction. And this is a completely open-loop EMG-driven robotic hand, which is basically able to mimic what a person is able to do by applying a particular using the EMG signals or the muscle signals to actuate a robotic hand. And this is what a prosthetic hand like this does as well. But what is missing, what is really missing, is a feedback system. So when we grasp something, when you grasp an egg, then you really don't know what is the force that you're applying to that egg, or whether you're letting it slip or whether it's too hard. And so this is the sort of last slide before I show this video and conclude. Jun, you want to help me with that? So while you watch this, I'll try and put this on. So this is work that we're doing with Touch Bionics on providing feedback. So I guess you can recognize some of the guys from the video. So it's pretty hard to light a match when you're anesthetized. So it's much harder to yeah. Yeah, there's actually a soundtrack which I forgot to sort of. But essentially, what we're trying to do here is to provide a sort of sensory feedback of the force that's being applied through these little vibrotactile sensors. And again, the component of learning is that people are able to adapt to this completely new sense. It's not a natural sense. It's a completely new sense, and you're able to adapt to that and actually map the forces that you apply to the vibration on your viable part of the skin. And we're running some clinical trials at the moment about the efficacy of these different codes of these vibration. Okay, so so with this thing, so I just actually want to show a little live demo of so now. So this is the Touch Bionics hand, and it's connected to my EMG muscle signal on the right, and I can actually open and close and sort of lift something and sort of put it back. So effectively, this is a way of using the viable part of your EMG signals to create a prosthetic for a person who's lost a limb and restore the motor actions. What is missing, indeed, is the fact that I have no idea of the force that's being applied when I grasp this. Okay, so why do we care about all these things? It's because most of the areas we're interested in these days, so rehabilitation robotics, entertainment robotics, medical robotics, exoskeletons, all involve much closer human-robot interaction. And essentially, learning and adaptability is a crucial element so that these robots work at least robustly and safely and maybe reach the kind of capabilities that humans are able to achieve without really thinking about it. So I want to thank, I will end by thanking the sponsors, Ed-Neuro for asking Barbara and myself to give this talk, and a bunch of academic and private and research labs who supported this effort, and most importantly, the group behind all this work. Sorry for running over a bit. Your canopies are waiting, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, well, I've just got a few words to say now. Okay, well, now of course you've got to adapt, because this picture is without snow. So you've now got to predict in your minds, going from what Barbara was saying, you have to lay over that a prediction of what it will look like with snow. We've also shown you your predicted path, so try and lay this down in your mushrooms. Oh, sorry, no, so your hippocampi. And try and end up below the red arrow. Now, of course, there won't be a real red arrow up there. Now, what the red arrow is doing is pointing to the Informatics Forum, and this is a very good point at which to say thank you very much to David Wilshaw, who's providing the party at the Informatics Forum. Thank you to Jane Haley, who's organised it. Thank you for coming. So now we're going to follow our robotic leader along to the Informatics Forum. Thank you very much indeed.
Sorry? Yes, yeah. I'm just into the wine. Yes, of course. Ah, okay. So, you know what? You want to actually carry the robot to the forum. We can play with it there. Yeah? I ran out of time. Yeah, sorry about that. Actually, yeah, you should touch these sensors because it'll start doing stuff. there is a correlation between what happens at your fingertips. So unless you account for it, if I do that, my fingertips, my end effector is moving. That's what I'm
Right, you don't compensate.
No, exactly. You don't compensate.
And there are other signals of connections between birds, etc.
Yes. So we have very idiosyncratic sort of correlations between what's happening, and so basically the idea is we can exploit those things very efficiently. That's why we are not multi-purpose. We do things very well.
So I'm in philosophy.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
I'm interested in action.
Okay, so yeah. Yes. Yes.
Literature
Absolutely. So there's work. It depends on what level you want to sort of calculate that. Maybe the right thing to do is to actually move over slowly.
Yes.
And then because I tend to forget.
Setting robots or meet an astronaut or meet Asimo. You met Asimo, didn't you? So that's
I think I have to. Good.
you came across them. Maybe what I'll do is have that be there. So I'll pack them these out.
Okay.
I'll see what
Let's walk.
So, I mean, one thing I'm
You're
going to...
talking to the Centre for Activation and Technology about a project that the idea was to put together a series of portrait pictures where I thought people to think about their experiences of aging. So well, I don't know how we do that, I'm quite close to that later. But the idea is that they pick out the essential sport and make the right choices. So it would be a way of thinking about how things that happen just change the way we feel about ourselves and about ourselves. But how we can also learn to make different life choices to change our life outcome. So for instance, an example would be someone who smoked who would then have high blood pressure, potential for lung cancer, heart attacks, and I don't know if there's any instances of stroke as well, because for us to know what's those sorts of choices, and we could build in things that we know that you can change about your lifestyle, like taking exercise and things like that, to help improve your outcome. Now initially we were thinking about it in terms of purely cognitive, because we were talking to cognitive aging, cognitive epidemiology, but then we thought, well, it could branch out a wee bit, but we want to try and keep it more neuroscience-y related. If we had no money, because the idea, it came out of a grant application that was being put into the Wellcome Trust that I was asked to look at, but I was asked to look at that very late stage. I looked at it, and the idea was to put together a series of portraits of people talking about themselves at various life stages, and I said, well, you need to do it more dynamically, make it into a film, make it something you can take around, show in theatres, film festivals, which is where I thought of you. And then I thought, make it driven by the audience, make it interactive. Okay. That never went into any of that application, and I never really spoke to them about it again, because it was quite clear they had a totally different agenda. They want to take little clips out to schools to teach groups of kids in schools. I'm utterly 99% certain they will not get a grant application. I don't believe it's innovative enough. I just don't think it's going to suit the granting agent they presented to. Like, because people just like, I think there's a lot better ones out. So I don't think it stands a chance at all. And at that stage, I just withdrew from the whole thing and said, look, that's fine, you go on with it. I just don't think it's going to go anywhere. However, the person I was working with in cognitive aging, who also very concerned about grant application, loves this idea. He's already done some work with an artist doing. He's already done a series of little films called Transformations, which is all about old people sort of changing perceptions of doing stuff.
What he's still filming
That's,
that?
no, it's already been done by an artist, but it's different
Okay.
because it doesn't interview them or anything like
Yeah,
that.
right.
It's not. It's just a series of sort of little motion things, and so they've got experience of doing that sort of thing, and they're very keen on it. So they want to kind of do something else. So
Alright.
they are very keen on this idea. And I was about to write to you, and then I decided to pull out of this grant application because there was not enough time. The
Yeah.
people weren't interested in. It was quite clear they weren't interested in deviating from their plan of going to schools. And I felt this was appropriate for film festivals and other audiences,
Yeah.
but could be used as a teaching tool as well as just a fun thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's where I thought of you. It took me ages to find your email address again, and then I never used it. So I can't remember your name now.
Richard.
That's right. Anyway, so that was my idea. We have no funding for it, but there's the potential that this centre, the Formative Ageing, they have quite a large pot of money to do public engagement work. Probably not large enough to cover something as big as I was envisaging, but they might be able to start Primate and then try and use that to get funding to make something bigger that could go around proper, you know, cinemas and film festivals and stuff. Do you think that's something that you might be interested in? I thought of you on several levels. One is because you said that you like doing films where people just talk to the camera, and that's exactly what we're talking about. And also because you take these film festivals, which is exactly the sort of audience I was thinking would be the right place to take it. I'm going to take the posters down as I leave, okay? That's everything with my numbers, isn't it? So, do you think that
It is something
if we
interesting.
were